Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, Chapter 8, Halacha 2. This is part 2 of 2 for the Shir, and we're going to be covering Netalat Yadayim. Now, yesterday we ended off talking about how Rabbi Yacha was saying that for Netalat Yadayim, one washes each of the hands and repeats the washing. And why would that be? Because they're trying to wash the water off the hand. And then we're also talking about how important Mayim Achronim is. That's going to be after the meal. Now, we ended up talking about whether this is going to be elective or not. In other words, should the Netalat Yadayim or the Mayim Achronim be elective or not? And we're going to talk about how important it is to do this stuff and why it really matters. You know, if you make small changes, even if you're religious, but you're making small changes in the tradition and you're making small changes in what you're supposed to do, you really can cause a lot of damage and harm. And you can really cause a lot of misery to people. Even small changes. I don't care if you're wearing a kippah on your head. I don't care if you're doing all the other stuff. But when you start making minute, small changes, you start to change the behavior and start to affect other people. The Gemara now is going to get into a story on the washing of the meal, and this is so important, and it's such an important concept, and it's so important to understand because when you have these movements that are like modern Orthodox or modern Haredi or these other movements where you have Haredi people that are doing the stuff, dressing in the outfit, but they're not exactly doing what they're supposed to be doing, you cause a lot of problems. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi said, for failure to wash the first waters, that by the way is going to be Netalat Yadayim, pork was eaten. In other words, there was a chain of event where somebody did not wash their hands before the meal. And in this chain of events, he ended up eating pork. And there's a famous story in Hulin in 106a that once upon a time there was a Jewish innkeeper who used to serve kosher food to the Jews, but he would feed non-kosher Jews to the non-Jews. And, why should you charge, kosher food's expensive. Why should you charge the non-Jews more money? Because they don't have to eat kosher food. They had 2 kitchens and everything else. And they were charging a lower price for the non-kosher food to the non-Jews. Sometimes it would even be Nevila in the story of Hulin 106. And one time a Jew comes into this inn. The other Jews are sitting there washing their hands. And this guy did not wash the hands before he ate. So the Jewish innkeeper saw he didn't wash the hands. And what does that trigger? It means that, to the innkeeper, he's assuming that he's a non-Jew. And he served him pork or nevila. So there's another idea, by the way, that's in Mishnah and Shvius in chapter 7, where a Jew is not allowed to be in the business of selling non-kosher food. But anyway, this story came about in Hulin in a time when Romans were here, and there was a lot of persecution. And what was happening was this Jew was, people would be killed because they were Jewish. So to hide the Jewishness, the innkeeper was serving non-kosher food to the non-Jewish customers. And when he recognized that somebody was Jewish, like by washing the hands, he would serve them the kosher food. So it could also mean that this innkeeper was a sinful person who was not looking at this restriction about selling non-kosher food. Or he could have been an observant person. He was afraid, pekuach nefesh. So either way, by the way, that's the note by the Marsha. The Marsha in this parallel in Hulin 106a holds that the innkeeper was a sinful person who ignored the restriction on selling non-kosher food. That's the opinion of the Marsha, and the Marsha has some of the most amazing insights on the shot for what's going on, and it's always great reading the Marsha. Anyway, so for failure to wash the first waters for Netalat Yadayim, pork was eaten in this story. And the Gemara is going to say another amazing part. The Gemara says, for failure to wash the second waters, that's going to be Mayim Achronim, a woman ended up getting divorced and was thrown out of her home, was left her home. And that's also another famous story. So the Haredim points out that according to this account, when Kedor was about to kill his wife, his son, who was in the house at the time, came and protested, and Kedor, in the anger, went and killed his son also. And on realizing what he did, Kedor became depressed and committed suicide, threw himself off the roof. So there's another story. There's different versions of what happened. This is going to be paralleling to Hulin 106a there as well. And in one version, Kedor became angry at the wife and divorced her. And in another version, he was so angry that he killed her and killed the son. So there's two versions of it. But anyway, what ended up happening? What's the story over there? By the way, you can also see this story in Yoma 83a in the Bavli. And the story also comes up in the Yerushalmi again elsewhere. And there was a case where the Bavli version, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yudah, and Rabbi Yossi was staying at an inn in Shabbat, and Rabbi Yudah and Rabbi Yossi gave their purses to the innkeeper, whose name was Kedor. And after the Shabbat, Kedor denied having been entrusted with their money. Now, these are Tanayim, and he's saying right to the faces of these famous Tanayim. I mean, these are famous people in the land. You never gave me the wallet. You never gave it to me to hold. What are you talking about? You must be crazy. You never gave me this wallet to hold. And they noticed that Kedor had some lentils in the mustache. In other words, some residue. Sometimes when you have a very long mustache that you don't trim and you're eating soups, some of that gets caught into your mustache. And that's why a lot of people will trim their mustaches. Anyway, so they saw he must have just been eating lentils, and they saw some of that soup sort of hanging in those long hairs. Not particularly the lentils itself, but they could see it was lentil soup. And what happened, very famous story, these Tanayim went to his wife, and they said to her, your husband says that you should return our purses so that you will know we are telling the truth. He told us to mention that you both ate lentils today. And she fell for the trick and returned the purses to them. Now, if Kedor washed the hands at the meal, Kedor was a Jew, he would have washed away the food residue from the mustache with his wet hands, as men with long mustaches typically do, and the lentil soup left over would not have been obvious. But when Kedor came to get the money, the wife told him that she returned it to the rabbis, and the rabbis told him the sign, the siman, on what Kedor had said in order to return it. This is what caused him to become so angry. So again, in one case that she got divorced because of it, and in another case, he actually just killed her and the son, and then himself. That's what happens when you make small changes in Judaism. You think, Mayim Achronim is not so important. Don't worry about it. I don't have to do this small thing. And in fact, you do. It's there to protect you. It's there for your own good. And that's what you don't understand about it. When you start giving discounts and you start trimming things off of Judaism, you start creating situations where the outcomes are going to change and people are going to treat you differently because of these small nuances, and you're going to impact other people and yourself So that's why you should always be looking at the Shulchan Aruch, and you should always be trying to understand, what are we supposed to be doing here as Jews? What is correct behavior, and how do we fix our correct behavior so we're not cutting out these things that don't seem very important but turn out to be very important in the end. The Gemara now is going to talk about another case about Netalat Yadayim. And Shmuel went up to visit Rav in Eretz Yisrael. Now, this is going to be where, before Rav ended up leaving and going to Bavel. So Shmuel went up to visit Rav in Eretz Yisrael, and he saw that Rav was eating a meal like the people there in Bavel with a cloth wrapped around his hands. Now, keep in mind, Rav was a Goan, and the Yerushalmi, which is put together in Eretz Yisrael, is going to always be talking about Atem there as dealing with the people of Bavel. So in the time there in Bavel, Atem, those people there were some people who were very lax on Netalat Yadayim. And so what they would do is, instead, these Kohanim, before they would wash a meal, they would simply wrap their hands in cloth. And so now Shmuel is wondering, hey, why are you wrapping your hands in cloth? And this also brings up another case. Can you just wrap your hands in cloth or gloves rather than going ahead and do Netalat Yadayim? How important is Netalat Yadayim? And so it looked like Rav did not wash his hands before the meal, and instead, to make sure that he's not coming in contact with the food with his hands, he's wearing the gloves. Shmuel says to him, he says, what is this? In other words, are you allowed to do this where you're wearing the gloves without washing your hands first? Now, the Bavli also has the same incident, Hulin 107a, and the incident is in the context of whether you're allowed to skip Netalat Yadayim and instead wear gloves. And the question is, are we saying that his hands are covered and there's no longer any kind of worry that he's going to make the food tameh because we're touching it? Or are we still going to be apprehensive that he might accidentally somehow touch the food even with these gloves? That's going to be the question over there. Now, Shmuel is holding that, one cannot obviously exempt himself from Netalat Yadayim by simply wearing gloves or wrapping your hands in cloth. So he's actually asking Rav, what are you doing? Because he's surprised by this behavior. And he's surprised because it looks like Rav holds the opposite, that if you're a Goan and you're worrying about touching Truma, that you could just put your hands into gloves, not do Netalat Yadayim, and it should be fine. That's how it looks like. So Shmuel asks, what are you doing? And Rav is going to explain that when he's using the cloth, he's not trying to get around Netalat Yadayim. And he's doing it for a different reason altogether. So, very important. He points out, no, we have the same opinion, and I'm not trying to get around this, but I'm doing it for a different reason. That's the first way he addresses it, and he's trying to diffuse that there's any maloket at all. And in the Gemara, he said to Shmuel, he says, and he confirms that he did wash his hands, but now he's going to explain why he's using the cloth, and he's going to say it is because he is a very fastidious, neat person, and he cannot bear to touch food with his bare hands. It makes him feel very bad to touch food with his hands, and he has a bad feeling with touching things like that he's going to eat. And so he already did wash his hands and do Netalat Yadayim. There's no question on that, but he's doing it for a different reason. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about another incident, and he's going to say, when Rabbi Zera ascended here to Eretz Yisrael, and he made Aliyah, he saw some Kohanim eating a meal like the people there. That's that Atem coming up again. Like the people in Bavel with cloth wrapped around or gloves on their unwashed hands. Now, in Bavel, they didn't wash their hands, and they were wearing gloves or putting it on cloth. And now he's coming to Eretz Yisrael, and he's surprised to see some Kohanim doing that. And Rabbi Zera said to them, he says in this Gemara, but there was this incident that took place involving Rav and Shmuel. And, we can see that from this case of Rav and Shmuel, that putting cloth on your hands does not exempt you, it does not get you out of having to perform netalat yadayim from the meal. And that's going to be the point. In other words, the Bavli is pointing out that it's a question. They're just leaving it as a question when the case of Shmuel and Rav. In the case of the Yerushalmi, the question comes up, but Rav continues it forward and saying, no, I'm doing it for a different reason, and here's the reason why I'm doing it. Now, there's going to be a defense of the Kohanim here, and it's going to say, even before Rabbi Zera had finished speaking, Rabbi Yosei Bar Kana came and said a ruling in the name of Shmuel that netalat yadayim is mandatory for those who always eat chulin, and that is for non-Kohanim, and they may not rely on eating with their hands covered. So there's something else going on over here, and the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say, but netalat yadayim is not mandatory for those who are not allowed to eat truma. But netalat yadayim is not mandatory for those who are allowed to eat truma. And who is that? Well, these are going to be the Kohanim who are allowed to eat truma. And the idea here is that, since the Kohanim are going to be very careful about this mitzvah, they may choose to eat without netalat yadayim if they keep their hands covered so they do not touch the food. So Shmuel is teaching, says a Haredim, that Kohanim are allowed to eat ordinary chulin bread with covered unwashed hands because they're careful, and it'll keep them from accidentally contaminating the food. And it seems here that they're acting in accordance with this ruling. And the Haredim in this statement is saying that the Kohanim may eat even chulin food by covering their hands, and that would conform, by the way, with the view of Rashi in Chulin 107b in the Bavli, and the Tosafot in the other parallel in the Bavli and Yoma, you find that in 79b, is saying that Shmuel's leniency only applies to Kohanim who are actually eating truma, since they will take great care to ensure that the truma remains tahor. And the Rambam in Hilchos Berechot in 618 says that the Bavli and Chulin phrases Shmuel's ruling a little bit differently, allowing for an interpretation that permits even non-Kohanim who are eating ordinary chulin to cover their hands and to do that with cloth instead of netalat yadayim. But the majority of Rishonim rule that non-Kohanim or Kohanim who do not regularly consume truma may never touch a cloth to avoid washing. So the opinion on the Rambam and then most of the Rishonim, there's going to be a maloket there. And what is the Beit Yosef going to say? Beit Yosef is going to conclude that one may rely on covering the hands with cloth only in extenuating circumstances where water is scarce and not readily available. So that's going to be the idea there. The Gemara has a dissenting view on this and says that Rabbi Yossi says netalat yadayim is mandatory for the Kohanim who are allowed to eat truma, just as it is for non-Kohanim who may eat only chulin, and it is basically not an option for anyone to cover their hands with cloth instead of washing them. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about a new topic, and a topic that is sort of like the next logical outcome. Well, if you can't cover your hands, and nobody's allowed to cover their hands unless, like the Beit Yosef, like you're in a time of scarce water, then how much of your hand do you have to wash? Okay, you have to wash your hands. Fine. How much? And that's what we're going to get into right now. So The Gemara says that Rabbi Yosa said in the name of Rabbi Chia bar Asi, and Rabbi Yonah said in the name of Rabbi Chia bar Asi, who in turn said in the name of Rav, Netalat Yadayim for Truma requires that water be poured over the entire hand until the wrist, whereas for Hulin, one need only pour enough to reach the knuckles at the end of the fingers where they join the hand. So the idea here, says the Pnei Moshe, is that since the purpose of enacting Netalat Yadayim for Hulin was only to preserve the practice for washing the hands for Truma, the sages allowed those who eat Hulin to fulfill the requirement in a more lenient way. That's going to be the idea. Now, the Gemara is going to have a more strict opinion here, and it's going to present the opinion of Rabbi Mayasha, the grandson of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who says, whenever anyone would be preparing to eat even Hulin with my grandfather, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and did not take care to wash his hands until the wrist, my grandfather would not eat with him. So the idea is, says the Haredim, that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is holding that for Hulin as well, that you have to wash until the wrist, and that's going to be the idea there. So there's another understanding of this Gemara, and the Ramban, in his commentary on a parallel to this in the Hulin 106b, says that according to this Yerushalmi, because he also had access to the Yerushalmi, to where Rav is mentioned and defined, where what he's saying is the perek mentioned by Rav is defined not as the wrist, but as the middle joints of the finger. So Rav is being more lenient for Truma, where he requires the washing merely to go until the middle joint, but for Hulin, he requires the washing extend to the knuckles. So the Ramban actually is reading this where it's even more lenient than this other opinion about that it would go up until where the middle joint would be. And in this case, in either way, in this case, whether it's going to be to the middle joint for Hulin and the top knuckle for Truma, or it's going to be to the top of the wrist. In either case, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is going to be more strict. Now, where do we follow the halacha? Well, we follow the halacha by Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi on this. So, just want to point that out. And also that with regards to Hulin, it says Or Chaim 161.4, one does not need to wash further than knuckles. And you can see more about that in the Beur Hagra and the Shulchan Aruch. So the Gemara is going to talk about another dispute regarding the extent of Netalat Yadayim and the requirement for Hulin food. Rabbi Huna says Netalat Yadayim is not required before eating any food except for bread. In other words, that the Chedushay Haran is explaining that since the sages instituted the Netalat Yadayim requirement for Hulin only to establish it as a routine for Truma for when the temple gets rebuilt, they limited this institution to bread, which is going to be the main part and the sustaining part of somebody's diet. So that's going to be the idea here by the Chedushay Haran. And the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say Rabbi Hoshea taught a Baraisa that Netalat Yadayim is required before eating anything that has upon it its moisture, the moisture of a liquid. In other words, that if you have any food that's dipped in a liquid, like a pickle, the idea is that according to Rabbi Hoshea, the sages are also going to require Netalat Yadayim for any food like a pickle that would have liquid on it, because the Tamei hands have the capacity to contaminate even Hulin foods. Now, I will point out to you something from the Mishnah Beur that it says that anybody who is handling a not bread, not a meal with bread, and a non-food that's a food that's not with liquid. In other words, not like a pickle, but let's say something that's going to be dry, like a biscuit or a muffin, maybe, or something that's going to be dry. Uh, I don't know. Just imagine a food that's going to be a dry food. Marshmallows, like marshmallows, right? And he's going to go do netalat yadayim on marshmallows. This is a bad person because this is somebody who's like showing off how holy he is in front of these people on something that's totally uncalled for. So we're talking about and limiting it to bread and also something that has the moisture of a liquid. And somebody who goes and does netalat yadayim on something that is not bread and does not have the moisture of a liquid, there's a lot of problems with this person, says the Mishnah Beur. So the Gemara continues, says, Rabbi Zera says that even one who is chewing lupine beans should wash his hands. Now, this is going to be for, this, by the way, is going to match up with the view in the Bavli in Hulin 106a, that somebody has to wash before eating any fruit or produce, even if it's dry. And the Bavli, the Bavli's conclusion is that washing for dried fruits is not obligatory, and it also might be a display of righteous conceit. But, says the Haredim, it's clear that Rabbi Zera is referring to dry lupines, for otherwise he would not be saying anything more than the previous ruling of Rabbi Hoshaya. In other words, he's adding to this ruling of Rabbi Hoshaya. And the Rosh Cirilio is interpreting Rabbi Zera's personal custom to wash the hands even before cutting and peeling wet lupines. So the Mishnah Beur is pointing out that for dried food like marshmallows, right? It's not a fruit. It's not bread. It's not a dried lupine bean or a wet lupine bean that was dried. Something like that. We're talking about a marshmallow. Okay, if you're washing for something like that, there's something wrong there. Okay, it's a person that is trying to be publicly holy, and he's doing more than the halacha. And the Gemara talks very badly about those kinds of people. And also in the Mishnah in Sota, it talks about these kinds of people as being destroyers because they're pretending like they're so religious in public, and then anytime they go and they do a sin, it's going to be very, very serious because it's like they're destroying the fabric of Judaism because they're pretending to be so religious, and look at them. So they're really, you really need to follow the halacha. You need to really follow this tradition. And don't add to it. Don't add to it. I was also learning in the Mishnah Beur about if on the bottom part of your tefillin, if you decide to embellish it and make it nicer and add the whole bottom part to be gold instead of the leather that you're supposed to have, are you allowed to use it? And the answer is you're not. It's pasul. And then you say to yourself, yeah, but I want to beautify the mitzvah. I want to make it even better. I want to add to it. You're not allowed to add to mitzvahs. The halacha, the tradition is what it is. Okay? And so that's what this is trying to define. And this is what we have to do. So there's going to be another law regarding the netalat yadayim for hulin. And Rav says, if one washed his hands in the morning, we do not trouble him to wash them again before eating in the afternoon. And there's going to be a similar ruling to that. Rabbi Avina instructed his donkey drivers as follows. It says, whenever you find water for washing, wash your hands, and make a stipulation that the washing should serve to make your hands tahor for the rest of the day. The Haredim is pointing out that he's recognizing how difficult it would be for these workers and laborers to obtain water before the evening meal. So Rabbi Avina is advising him to wash at the first opportunity and then to specify that it should be for the rest of the day. This, by the way, is how we know about these cases where what happens if water is hard to find. So the Gemara now is going to talk about an incident that will lead to another ruling about Netalat Yadayim. And Rabbi Zera went up to visit Rabbi Abahu in Caesarea. I'm not sure if this is Caesarea in the Goan area or Caesarea in the sea area. There was a area of learning in Caesarea Philippi in the Golan area. There was also an area of learning in Caesarea Maritima. So I'm not sure which one. And Rabbi Abahu found him and said, "Let us go eat a meal together." At the beginning of the meal, he gave Rabbi Zera a round loaf of bread that was to be cut. And he said to them, "Take this loaf and recite the blessing of Hamotzi on behalf of everyone who is seated here." And Rabbi Zera says to him in reply in this Gemara, he says, "A householder recognizes his loaf's potential." In other words, the host who has the greatest inclination to distribute the bread generously should be the one to say the blessing. And Rabbi Abahu conceded on this, and he said the blessing himself. Rabbi Abahu said the blessing on the bread because the idea was that the householder is going to be the most proud of this bread, this beautiful round loaf, and he's going to give out the most generously. In other words, because of this inclination of the householder having this nice bread and making it or having it made in his house, he's going to be the best one to give out the bread because bread is a sign of blessing. And there's a lot of deep mystical things, as we covered in Berechot already, about the deep aspects of bread and in the Garden of Eden. And so it's like really he should be the one who's giving it out. And the Gemara continues, says, when they finished eating, Rabbi Abahu said to Rabbi Zera, "Take up the wine and recite for us the blessing of Berechot Hamazon." And Rabbi Zera said to him, "My master, Rabbi Abahu, certainly recognizes that Rav Huna is a great man. And Rav Huna would often say that the one who begins the meal with the blessing of Hamotzi is the one who should end the meal by leading Berechot Hamazon." In other words, that Rabbi Abahu is being hinted at by Rabbi Zera is that he really should be the one. Rabbi Abahu should be the one to recite Hamotzi, and then Berechot Hamazon, and he should say the Berechot Hamazon because he said the Hamotzi. That's really the idea based on Rav Huna. Gemara now is going to look at the ruling of Rav Huna, and here's how it goes. And the Gemara says that there's a brisa that apparently contradicts Rav Huna. For a brisa taught, the order of washing hands for a meal is as follows. If there are up to 5 people in attendance, we begin from the most prominent one. And that's going to be the one who's the strongest in Torah, by the way. Or a Cohen. In particular, you want a Cohen who is a Torah scholar. But also, I was learning in the Mishnah Beur that what happens if you have a Cohen who is not learned and you have the Torah scholar there, then the Mishnah Beur is saying that you should give it to the Torah scholar, and it's right to give to the Torah scholar because you denigrate the Torah in front of the eyes of everybody else. So what will happen is they'll say, "Oh, you see the Cohen, he doesn't even know anything, and he's higher than the Torah scholar." So you end up denigrating the Torah. So you always want to do something sort of polite, and say to the Cohen, "Oh, do you mind if we give it to the Torah scholar," or something like that. That's a way to get out of it, so you don't offend anybody. And the Gemara is gonna challenge this ruling with Rabbi Huna, and it's going to say that if there are up to 5 people in attendance, we begin from the one that's most prominent, and if there are more than 5, we begin from the least prominent one. So What's that going to be? That's going to be saying that, the practice was that after everyone washed their hands, says the Haredim, one person would say the blessing of Hamotzi on behalf of the others. And as such, says the Haredim, it would be disrespectful to have the most prominent person wash first, because this would compel him to sit quietly and do nothing until everyone is finished washing and the meal could begin. And if there was 5 people or less, the prominent person would wash first, because it doesn't take a long time for the other people to wash. So the Gemara is going to continue, and so I'm sorry. In the Mishnah Beur, it's talking about when you're going to be doing zimun. When you're going to be doing zimun, and you have a Torah scholar or you have a Goan. This is talking about the order of washing the hands before the meal, and so you would begin from the most prominent one. That would be the Goan. You'd ask the Goan if there's up to 5 people. If there's like 4 people, and say, "Oh, please, our 6 over here. Why don't you wash the hands?" But you also want to bless the Kohanim. So similar cases could also come up as well. But again, you also don't want to ever denigrate the Torah. So you always want to give it to the Torah scholar in general over the ignorant Goan. So if there are more than 5 people, we begin with the least prominent one. The idea is that we don't want the person sitting around who's the most prominent doing nothing. And regarding the washing that is done in the middle of the meal, we always begin from the most prominent person. And the idea is that, there's no reason not to commence this immediate washing from the most prominent person, as each person would eat separately, reclining in their own couch, and they could immediately begin the next course without waiting for other people. That's the idea. And so regarding the washing is done in the middle of the meal while you're having, all these courses, we always begin from the most prominent person. And regarding the washing of mayim achronim after the meal, we begin with the one who will recite the blessing of Berechot Mazon. And then, even if the others are of higher status at the present, the one who has been chosen to lead Berechot Mazon, when the most prominent person cedes that privilege to him, is given the honor of washing mayim achronim. There's also a lot of connection between this final blessing and blessings with Avram Avinu, and you can find more about that in the chapter of Zimun in the Mishnah Beur, which connects all the points about Avram Avinu with this blessing. And the Gemara is now going to conclude this question. Now, why does the washing of the mayim achronim begin from the one who's going to say Berechot Mazon? The Gemara is going to say, is it not so that he should be alerted to prepare himself for reciting the blessing? But if you say that the one who begins the meal with the blessing of Hamotzi is always the one who concludes it by leading Berechot Mazon, as Rabbi Huna is holding, why, he is already prepared from the beginning of the meal. So what need is there to wash with mayim achronim first? And the Gemara is going to defend Rabbi Huna. Rabbi Yitzchak says, interpret the brisa as referring to those who arrived in a piecemeal fashion to the meal, so that no individual was privileged to recite Hamotzi on behalf of the entire group of people, because they came into these, appetizer courses in bits here and bits there, and it wasn't done where he could say it for the entire group of people. And the Gemara is going to finish up the halacha and say that, and they therefore do not know who will be the one to recite the blessing of Berechot Mazon. So the point is, in this case, it's necessary to begin the washing of mayim achronim from the one who was chosen to recite Berechot Mazon, in order that he may prepare himself to recite the blessing. And the idea here from the Sidei Yeshua is that the Gemara appears to be concluding that whenever an individual recites Hamotzi on behalf of others, he is the one who leads Berechot Mazon as well. Now, the Bavli does not hold that opinion. The Bavli in 46a in Berechot holds this is true only when the host is not in attendance, but if the host is present, he's the one who should recite the Hamotzi. so that the bread will be distributed generously, like with what Rabbi Zera was hinting at with Rabbi Abahu. Anyway, that concludes Halacha 3, chapter 8, Halacha 3. We're going to get into Halacha 2. We're going to get into Halacha 3 tomorrow. And we can see here the tragedies that can come when you start to modify Judaism, when you start to make these adjustments to change things around and to cut out things that in your mind don't seem so important. But in actuality, this Gemara is teaching us that you shouldn't tamper with the tradition. Everything is there for a reason. Leave it alone. Just do the stuff you're supposed to do and learn more so you could know what to do. Don't play with it. Thank you. Have a great day.